Welcome everyone to the 2023 budget process, budget work session, economic outlook and 5-year financial forecast on February 14th, 2022. Welcome to Councilmember Hall, Councilmember Vanstrom, Councilmember Hills, Councilmember Morthland, to our City Clerk Marley Clark, our City Attorney David Davidson, our City Administrator Randy Knighton, and to the main presenter tonight, the outstanding Ryan Luckett. Councilmember Palermo will be joining us shortly. And with that being said, the ball is now your hands, Ryan, so please lead us the rest of the way.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you again. So we are here this afternoon to go over our 5-year financial forecast and to provide you a little bit of information on an economic outlook as well. Our agenda for this afternoon, we're going to start with just a quick review of our current budget policies and principles, the 2022 economic outlook, a 5-year forecast for our general fund as well as several of our other enterprise funds. A review of our 2023 budget calendar, and then just open it up for any questions. So to get us started, I did just want to quickly review what we have today in terms of our city budget policies and principles. And so the first thing is our reserve policy, and this applies to our general fund as well as our enterprise funds. This is a policy adopted by Mayor and Council, and what this policy says is that in the general fund, we will maintain a reserve of at least 3 months operating expenditures in the general fund. In our enterprise funds, the policy is a little bit different. The enterprise funds are required to maintain a reserve of 10% of unrestricted fund balance from the prior fiscal year, as well as maintaining a quick ratio of at least 1. Revenues in our enterprise funds, we also aim for 101% of projected expenses, and if that fund happens to have debt associated with it, which would be like our water fund, water utility fund, as well as our soon-to-be solid waste fund, then we are aiming for 105% of projected expenses. So that's our reserve policies. Principles are more just operating principles that have been in place in the past, and they've been around for a while. And also considered best practices. They're not necessarily required by law, but just more of a principle that we functioned on here at the city. One is that in our general fund, we do strive for it to be structurally balanced, meaning that our recurring operating expenditures are funded with recurring revenues. So we're not using one-time resources or fund balance to fund salaries and things like that that are happening every year. That is over and above what state law requires. So state law requires that our reserves plus our revenues cover our operating expenses on an annual basis. One caveat to that as well is that within our operating expenditures in the past, we have aimed for that to include our recurring maintenance capital. Those are the big ticket maintenance items like our park maintenance, road resurfacing, facility maintenance, those kinds of things. We haven't been as successful, not in the last couple of years, because of the challenges associated with the budget, but that is part of what we strive for as part of our budget principles. And then finally, kind of similar take on this, is that our reserves above policy, so we have our 25% reserve, anything above that, we use for one-time expenses only, and typically that's used for one-time capital projects. So getting into a 2022 economic outlook, this is information provided by the University of Georgia's economic outlook provided through their Terry College of Business. And just to give you some brief highlights and bullet points about what they expect to see in 2022. They do see the economy being on track to exceed our pre-pandemic peak by the end of 2022. They're projecting GDP growth in Georgia by 4.3%. This current year, as well as the jobs returning to their pre-pandemic counts in this year as well, with average unemployment being around 3.2%. They pegged the risk of the economy entering a recession this year at about 20%. They see job growth, higher wages, and savings driving consumer spending. They expect businesses to increase their spending on new technology and equipment by 6%. The desire for bigger homes and private spaces is part of what's driving home prices and home building. Challenges in to the Georgia economy continue to be things like supply and labor shortages, and the result from that obviously being inflation. And they do see the pandemic risk as low in terms of affecting the economy this coming year. I did also want to share some additional bits of information from a presentation by the state fiscal economist that presented to the Georgia General Assembly in regards to the state budget. Some of the things that he saw was that personal income today is about 8% higher than it was back in January 2020. And that through the pandemic, Georgia residents have accumulated about $75 billion in savings over the pandemic, which is equal to about 2 months' worth of spending. As federal aid starts to wind down to states and individuals, he does expect to see a slowdown in spending as we finish out FY 2022. Not a recession, just returning back to normal levels of consumer spending. And the fact that consumer debt levels are low and that people have accumulated quite a bit of savings, if we were to see a recession, he does expect that the state and individuals would be able to weather a recession fairly well coming up. But again, the risk of a recession is low. Just want to also present a few other statistics regarding the economy. So this shows you the unemployment rate for the metro Atlanta area. This is from the Department of Labor. Just showing you that as of, starting back in December 2020, we were still at 5.8%, all the way until the most recently available month, December 2021. The Atlanta area unemployment rate was down to 2.3%. Consumer spending, you can see that as of the most recent information listed here, which was October 2021, consumer spending was about 22% higher as compared to January 2020. And then in regards to inflation, this graph that you see on the left kind of gives you a picture over the last several years of the change in the consumer price index, and you can see that last available month where we had an increase of inflation of about 7.5%. The graph on the right is a survey of 69 different economists printed. This was part of a Wall Street Journal survey, economic forecasting survey. And so they have provided their estimate or their take on what they see inflation happening over the next several years. And you can see by the end of 2022, they do expect it to moderate by the end of 2022. And then finally, just as a bit of information, some economic indicators, forecasted indicators for the Atlanta Metropolitan Statistical Area. This is from Moody's Analytics, just to provide you a picture of some key economic indicators here. So again, gross metro product expected to continue to grow through this time period shown here of 2026. The employment rate continuing to grow. Personal income, I will point that out right here. So you can see 2020-21 was a strong year, but they're sort of also confirming what others are seeing in that there is expected to be a little bit of a slowdown just because of the federal aid that's ending, but not something that's going to push us into any type of recession. But
Right.
Personal income.
Can I ask you a quick question? What is the geographic area included in this?
So it's the entire metro area. So moving on to getting into our 5-year financial forecast discussion. Before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts and the numbers, I did want to just provide a little bit of context in what this is and what we're looking at. The forecast itself is really just a fiscal management tool that we use, and it's a best practice looks at estimated information based on past, current, and projected future conditions, financial conditions. The goal is to identify future trends that may have a short or long-term impact on the city. The forecast itself is not a proposed budget, so we're not here to tell you what we expect the budget to look like, and in general, it's just based on a set of assumptions. And then finally, just to let you know, the forecasting exercise is something we do also because it's viewed favorably by our bond rating agencies. They want to see that we're actually taking the time to look ahead and look for any trends that may be presenting challenges to the city. As we go through this, you may have questions about particular revenues. I did want to say that we are hoping to do a specific work session in the next month just on revenues to provide you some more in-depth information. If you have questions today, feel free to ask them, but I did want to let you know that we're going to get into a little more in-depth here in the coming weeks. Throughout all the forecasts that you'll see this evening, there's some general assumptions that I wanted to go ahead and cover so I'm not having to repeat them every single time we talk about a different fund. But to get into those, so for inflation, we used Moody's Analytics to come up with our forecast for inflation for the Atlanta metro area. So FY 2023 is not really talking about today. We're talking about what we expect to happen actually when fiscal year 2023 starts, which would be in July. So you can see here, this looks a little bit lower than what we're hearing today, but it's looking ahead that they do expect to see inflation moderating as we go through through the calendar year 2022 and getting us into FY 23. So for this first year, 3.57%, and then hovering around 2% for the forecast period. On the employee health insurance side, this information is based on a 5-year rolling average of our gross cost per employee. So we're seeing ranges from 4.7% to a high in 7% in FY24, and then anywhere from around 4.5% to 5.5% projected increases in the cost of employee health insurance. Additionally, in the numbers that you see this evening, we also have included assumptions for increases related to employee retirement expenses. And again, that's just based on historical trends that we've seen. Okay, so getting us into the general fund, I'm going to start by going over our revenue assumptions for our major revenues, and then we'll finish up the general fund by actually looking at the hard numbers and what those look like. So taking a look at our property tax, our forecast includes a projection for FY 2023 that's based on our digest value as of this year, and we have taken into account estimates for exemptions, appeals, and growth. On the residential side, we have estimates for new growth included, and that's based on information from community development where they've issued COs over the past year, and theoretically those would be showing up on the digest January 1st. So what we are including in FY23 is about $90 million in residential new growth, only about $10 million on the commercial side for FY 2023. Residential property, you can see here also we're talking about the big driver. One of our big drivers is our floating homestead exemption. And the way that works is basically everybody's residential homestead, the growth in that is capped at the rate of inflation or a maximum of 3%. And so we know already today what that's going to be for FY 2023. And as you might imagine, with the rate of inflation as it is, it's going to be 3%. So every resident that has the floating homestead exemption will see their base value grow by 3%. And so on those parcels, we would then in turn see growth of 3% in our revenues, unless there's a change in the millage rate. The remaining years of the forecast, when we're looking at our floating homestead exemption, the remaining years are based on those inflation rates that I showed you earlier, hovering around 2% in those outer years. On the commercial side, as I mentioned, we're only seeing about $10 million in commercial growth for FY 2023 in the digest. For the remaining years of the forecast, we have included inflationary growth projected at 3% on commercial property. And again, that's simply based on the trend that we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, an average of 3%. I will say on the residential side, we have included some estimates for growth, new property growth over the forecasted period. In FY24 and 25, about $50 million annually, and then that decreasing in 26 and 27 to about $25 million on an annual basis. Another thing on the commercial side, we have some big projects that are happening right now with the West Alley Hotel, Southern Skillet, and a few other hotels. Unfortunately, the West Alley Hotel is abated. The property is abated, so we won't see that growth in our digest for 20 years. Simply on the digest, we'll see growth on sales tax, we'll see growth in hotel motel tax. The Southern Skillet, as far as I could tell, looks like it's mostly abated, and that was through the Fulton County Development Authority. It looks like of a roughly $100 million project, about $75 million of that was abated through the Development Authority. So that was as best as I could tell from what I could see.
So clarifying question on that. So you mentioned the West Alley Hotel project, it's been abated for 20 years. And does that mean that the city would recognize zero property taxes on it over the next 20 years? Or it's just the increase in property taxes is what the city won't see for 20 years?
It would be zero because the property will be owned by the DDA.
Okay.
So it'll be
that
exempt from property taxes.
And then when you say the Southern Skillet project or the Southern Post project, you said that's mostly abated. Does that, or you said partially, so does that mean that we'll see partial taxes, we just won't see full property taxes on it, or?
That was my understanding. From what I could tell, it looked like the Development Authority had done their part on about $75 million of the roughly $100 million project.
And so basically, whether it's a Roswell Downtown Development Authority or if it's a Fulton County Development Authority, either way, they have the authority to just create all the terms of the abatements and no requirement to give the exact details to the city or to get weigh-ins, or how does that typically work?
I do know that with the hotel with West Alley, from what I can tell in the MOU that was signed, they worked with the school districts, and the school districts will actually receive payments, continue to receive payments based on the current value of that property. The way each of those developments are going about is sort of different, where the hotel is going to be owned by the DDA, and so it'll be exempt. From what I could tell with the Skillet property, I think there's some sort of agreement between the two between the developer and the agency that would have abated the property taxes. There wasn't a lot of detail available, so I'm not quite as sure on that one on the Skillet side.
So thank you for giving that clarification.
Sure. Lastly, I did want to point out with our property tax revenues, the forecast does not assume any change in the millage rate for the forecasted period. So we're assuming the same millage rate that we have today. Getting into property tax revenue, I did want to point out another point of clarification here. When you see us talk about property tax revenue, we're talking about one big category of property tax revenue. When there are actually, you can see here, 7 different really components of property tax revenue. A portion of property tax revenue is directly driven by the millage rate that you all set. A portion of it is not. About 86% of our total property tax revenue is driven by the millage rate that you all adopt. And so that includes the millage rate that's on our real property, personal property, public utilities, and motor vehicles. On the side that's not driven by the millage rate, the biggest part of that is the title ad valorem tax. So that's the tax that someone pays when they register a new vehicle in the state. And that is simply the value of the vehicle times the tax rate, which is currently at 6.6%. That's divvied out among the state and local governments. We collect annually roughly $2.5 million from title ad valorem tax. The 2 other revenues that you see here are driven by really the real estate industry. The real estate transfer tax is exactly what it is. As real estate is transferred between owners, there's a tax on that, and we receive a portion of that. The recording tax deals more with financing, and so when a mortgage is issued, there's a tax included in that, and that is shared among local jurisdictions. So I just want to provide that little bit of caveat there as we got into this. So this gives you a history, a 10-year history of our property tax revenues. These are the ones solely driven by the millage rate. And sort of showing two things here. The red bars show you our gross property tax digest. And then the blue line gives you our property tax revenues in the general fund. And so just to point out a few things here, from 2012 to 2018, you can see really how stagnant our digest was. Really a function of very little reassessments happening at that time. From 2012 to 2018, about 6.6% of actual growth in the digest over that whole entire period of time. Of course, we all remember the change here between 2018 and 19, when in the matter of 1 year, the tax assessor's office attempted to catch up the property tax digest, and so our tax digest grew about 20% in 1 year, from 2018 to 2019. About $1 billion was added to the Roswell property tax digest. Since that time, we've had regular growth, but also within that time, we've had the floating homestead exemption. So even though we see growth in the digest, we may not be seeing that growth, same growth within our revenues if they're capped by the floating homestead exemption. A couple other things to point out. You can see the little asterisks here on these 2 years represent 2 years that the property tax rate was reduced. So in 2019, the millage rate was reduced by $0.5 mil, and that was in response to the huge increase in property values that we saw, so to offset some of that increase. And the property tax rate was also reduced here in FY 2022 as well. I also wanted to share with you a 10-year history of our millage rate. And so you can see at the top, we have the total millage rate that residents pay. As I mentioned before, so FY19, about a $0.5 mil decrease, and then another $0.25 mil decrease in FY 2022. You'll also notice that within the total rate, there's also been adjustments between the M&O side and the debt side. And that explains why here, back to this slide, even though our digest was staying the same, our general fund revenues increased because a portion of our millage rate moved from our debt service to the M&O side of our millage rate. So all this bringing us to FY 2022, currently we're at 4.718%, a rate of 4.718. And as I mentioned, that is the same and maintaining that rate throughout the forecasted period. Talking about local option sales tax, this is the penny that's collected in Fulton County and is distributed among the county and all the cities. The city of Roswell today receives 8.9598% of those collections in Fulton County. Of course, one of the things that is coming up would be the negotiations to look at that percent that may be changed with the new census.
Ryan, if it's determined the same way that it was 10 years ago, what would that percentage be today?
If it was the same percentage as it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, it's based on population was, I think, the agreement 10 years ago. If that ends up being the result of the negotiations, which I am not forecasting, what would our percentage be today?
To be honest with you, I haven't looked at
No
it.
worries. Got it. Sorry.
Sure.
Mr. Knighton, yes, sir.
Ryan, what's our total collection from lost is about 27 million, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Which is a part of the general fund budget.
right. And so in the forecasted period, we haven't forecasted any type of change within the percent that we would be eligible for. In looking at the actual projection, our Fy22 estimate for sales tax does represent the largest sales tax amount in city history. We're estimating that this year in Fy22, we'll collect about $30 million in sales tax revenue. Today, we are running about 15 to 20% ahead of the prior year, and about 10 to 15% ahead of our projections. As I've mentioned a couple times already, we are anticipating a slight slowdown in FY 2023 just because of the assumption is that the tremendous amount of growth that we're seeing in our sales tax revenue now is, to some degree, that is one time because of pent-up demand. And so we did want to recognize that we think some of that will subside, but that we will continue to see growth as we move through the forecasted period. And so what we're showing in the forecast is 3% in FY24 and FY25, and then 2% annually thereafter. So this gives you an indication of our sales tax revenue over the last 10 years. So from FY12 to FY21, we've seen average annual growth of about 3%. And for the forecasted period, we're looking at right about 2% is what we're forecasting there. And so you can see here for FY22, as I mentioned, we're at 30 million. This shows you here the effect that we saw with COVID, and we've gradually recovered from that over the last couple of years. So those are our two big revenue sources. The other revenues within the general fund, our projections are based on the rate of inflation. If we're looking at operating expenses within the general fund, the forecast assumes the continuation of the current service levels that we have today. As I mentioned before, we have forecasted employee health and retirement projections based on historical trends. Overall operating expenses, we've included some growth based on the rate of inflation. And any of the things that are known increases or decreases have also been factored in. And that would include things like our debt service, compensation adjustments that we know kind of carry over to next year, any adjustments that were made at mid-year as well. This is something new that we've never done in terms of the forecast that I kind of want to walk you through. So we have a section, and you'll see this on the one-pager, and as we get into the numbers, something we've kind of termed additional spending and revenue and spending considerations. Basically, these are certain revenue and expenditure items that we've included below the line of the forecast to kind of show you individually the impact of those items in the forecast. Really highlights particular financial considerations for mayor and council in FY23 and beyond. Really those typical things that come up in every budget process. So we're talking about employee compensation, contributions to the 911 fund, our partner organization funding, recurring maintenance capital, and some revenue sources that we also have the option of utilizing within our general fund. So to get into the actual numbers, so first, this shows you our revenues for the general fund. We've kind of collapsed it down to make it a little more digestible. We have our property tax, sales tax, and other revenues. So here what you see, the first two columns is our FY22 approved budget, our FY22 estimate. So we are expecting $87.2 million in revenue for FY22, which is quite a bit better than our actual approved budget. Most of that's driven by our sales tax revenue. And then getting into the outer years of the projection, these numbers really just represent everything I just described in terms of all the assumptions that we've made in property taxes, sales tax, and our other revenues. Overall, we're seeing the forecast is showing about a 10% increase in general fund revenues from the 22 estimate to FY27 projection. Next, we get into the expenditure side of the forecast. And what you see here, again, our approved budget, our estimate. So our approved budget was about $80.4 million, 80.4. Our estimate is at $86 million. That $86 million estimate includes any changes that were approved by Mayor and Council through the mid-year. It includes any purchase orders or projects that got carried forward from the prior year. We also split out, as you can see, we split out, this is by type, so we have personnel expenses, operating, transfers and other, maintenance capital, and then our one-time capital expenditures. So overall, that's was an approved budget of 82.3, and we are estimating 88 million. In the outer years of the forecast, again, this is all driven by all the different assumptions that we went over. Operating mainly being grown by the rate of inflation, our transfers and other category, also driven by rate of inflation, but anything that we also know is going to happen in regards to debt service. On the personnel side, what's included in here is any adjustments that we forecasted for health benefits and retirement. We have not included anything for compensation, and because we want to show you that to you below the line in just a moment.
Ryan, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So on that slide, you've got basically one-time capital charges on both maintenance and one-time capital, but there's no projections for 23, 24, 25, 26, or 27. Can you go into that for a second?
Sure. So on the maintenance capital piece, that's something that we wanted to show you below the line, so that'll be on the next couple of slides. On the one-time capital, we haven't included anything with that, mainly because that is a couple of reasons. One is typically that's funded by any fund balance that we have that's over and above our reserve policy. And really just to keep it simple, honestly. So we'll show you a forecast for maintenance capital. One-time capital is a little more based on the funding that we may have available in that particular year. It's a little harder to anticipate. Yes?
Can you give us an example of items that one-time capital might fund?
Sure. It could be an intersection improvement, and it could be a new sidewalk, something that is really truly one-time in nature, as compared to the maintenance side, which we're talking about recurring maintenance items like road resurfacing, facility maintenance, those types of things. If that makes sense. So the next slide kind of brings both of those together. And so what you see is, and we're still above the line. So for our approved and our estimate, so our approved budget, we had a beginning balance estimated at $21.8 million, total revenues of 80.4, total appropriations of 82.3. That left us with an ending fund balance of 19.9. When we factor in our 25% reserve of 19.9, that left us with about $16,000 in ending balance over reserve. That was our approved budget. On the estimate for 2022, once we factor in how we ended FY 2021, then we see how well we ended FY 2020, because our beginning balance in FY 2022 is about $9 million higher. So when we factor in those updated revenues to the $87 million, $88 million of appropriations, that leaves us with a $29.9 million ending fund balance. With our reserve policy taken out, we're estimating that we'll end the year with about $9.9 million in fund balance over reserve in the general fund.
I've got a question for you.
Sure.
You're not smiling. I'm just curious. When you say that, you ought to be smiling, right?
I'm smiling on the inside. It's good. So moving forward, really, these are all the numbers we've talked about already. And you can see that going forward, before we factor those items in, and we've talked about that will be below the line, we have a favorable fund balance going throughout the forecast, all the way from the $9.9 million in this year to $44 million in FY 2027. But don't get too excited about that, because I'm going to show you some of these other items that I wanted to.
Okay, now you're smiling when you're giving us the bad news.
Sorry. Sorry. So this information at the top, same information I just showed you here. Once we're factoring in these additional revenue and spending considerations, we're getting a better idea of kind of what the picture looks like based on what some of these assumptions are. The first item here is factoring in an average 3% merit-based compensation for employees. What you see here is cumulative, so it's roughly $1.3, $1.4 million a year. The second item I wanted to spend just a minute on, that's the general fund contribution to our E911 fund. FY22 this year was the first year that the general fund has had to supplement the 911 fund. So this year, the general fund is transferring about $290,000 to help that fund. Most E911 funds across the state are supplemented by the general fund. We've been lucky in the fact that we haven't had to do it up until this year. We worked with our 911 director to put together a forecast for our E911 fund. And just making some rough assumptions on kind of 2% growth in revenues in that fund, not including any new positions for 911 staffing and some other things that they need. This is the trend that we're seeing with contributing to 911, which is growing at a pretty rapid pace. So another nearly $400,000 in 23 to almost $800,000 in FY 2027. Next, partner organization funding. This is something that's also is just kind of a little bit volatile and fluctuates with every budget year. Just to provide something in there, we've shown $650,000 annually going to partner organizations. Maintenance capital funding. Here, we've plugged in $6 million annually, and that would include things like, as I mentioned, road resurfacing, facility maintenance, park maintenance, just to name some of the major items that are usually within that category. Those are all the different expenses. And then the last two lines that you see here are two revenues that we have access to, and is something that is typically decided on a year-by-year basis how to utilize those funds. First, the auto rental excise tax. That is narrow, a little bit narrow in terms of what we can use it for. The past couple of years, those funds have been used to support Roswell, Inc. But that has about $300,000 a year is what we bring in through that revenue source. On the hotel motel side, these funds represent just the unrestricted portion of the hotel motel tax, which can be used for any purpose whatsoever. This year, I think we're expected to transfer about $350,000, but as we've seen that starting to recover, that revenue source, we're expecting that to continue to grow. So $500,000 the first couple of years of the forecast. The year that you see here, FY25, FY26, that's taking into account the impact of the 3 new hotels that we are expecting to open around that time period. So around $1 million a year, once those are open, is what we expect to see. So netting all those expenses and revenues, you see that adds about 7.5 all the way to $13.3 million. When we adjust our reserve policy to make up for the increase in operating expenses, this is the kind of final ending balance that we see. So the first 2 years, we're still looking good, but those last 3 years is when we start to see some dipping into the negative. Graphically speaking, the blue line here represents revenues, our red line represents total expenditures, and then you see the purple section that factors in those additional items that we just went over. In my mind, kind of what I see here is kind of going back to that aspirational goal of trying to fund maintenance capital within our recurring revenues. It's happened in the past. It hasn't happened lately in the past couple of years. Basically, what you're seeing these first couple of years is that we're using some of our fund balance to fund some of those recurring maintenance items. There's nothing legally wrong with that. There's no reason we can't do that. It's just our principle and our aspirational goal in the past has been for recurring revenues to cover operating expenditures, including recurring maintenance.
So Ryan, just for clarity, you're saying in what year did we stop including ongoing operational maintenance capital expenses? And we took that as a regular feature out of the budget and made it kind of exclusionary.
It's been more abrupt the last couple of years during the COVID pandemic. Before that, most recurring maintenance was funded by recurring revenues, with the exception of road resurfacing was sort of in and out, depending upon the available funding that we had at the time. So it's really been the last couple of years where we've really struggled to fund facility maintenance, park maintenance, some of those big ticket items that usually we were always funding. They've always been part of the operating budget, haven't been the last couple of years.
And that's kind of a standard operating procedure in your world anyway, from city to city. You want to fund those on an ongoing basis out of your general fund, do you not?
Yes, I mean, it's part of being structurally balanced, and I'll tell you, I mean, it's an aspirational goal for a lot of entities, and a lot of entities never achieve that because they just can't. So it's something here in Roswell we have achieved in the past, we still want to try and achieve, but it's been difficult the last few years.
But from your perspective as a professional, you don't want to create any kind of debt service around that kind of spending. That should be ongoing spending that you are doing as part of your general fund.
Right.
Correct?
Right. So just to bring all this down, to summarize everything, as I mentioned, favorable ending fund balance in FY23 and FY24. Expenditures begin exceeding available resources in FY25 and beyond. The challenge still exists to fund recurring maintenance capital with recurring revenues. And as I mentioned, FY23 shows that we would have to utilize some fund balance to fully fund maintenance capital. And this is kind of stating the obvious, but your direction during the budget process and beyond will kind of help provide clear direction for us in terms of what opportunities and challenges and how exist and how we'll address those as we move forward in the budget process.
Could you give us a little more guidance and clarity on the second bullet? The challenges to the fund recurring maintenance capital will require some utilization of fund balance. Can you give us a little layman clarity on that?
Sure. If you take a look right here, so the blue line is our revenues. If we're just looking at total operating expenditures, we're good. More revenues than total operating expenditures. It's when we start to factor in these additional expenditures, which the bulk of that is going to be maintenance capital. It's when we start to factor that in that we see total all expenditures is exceeding revenues. And so what would be required is that we have to use fund balance to make up that difference.
So I'm asking you, as a professional in this business, should maintenance capital not be part of that? It should not be an extraordinary item. Today, it's considered an extraordinary item. Is that a fair statement? The way we currently calculate it, and from your worldview and the way we used to do it, it was not an extraordinary item. It was part of ongoing budgetary concerns.
Generally, yes. I mean, the goal is for that to be part of our recurring operating budget.
And that would make, I'm going to assume, that makes your life easier and better from forecasting and budgeting perspective if we did that.
Sure.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Yeah, feel free to shoot us straight, brother.
Okay.
I just want to follow up to make sure that I'm understanding what Mayor Wilson is asking or saying. So in theory, there should be no purple there. That purple should be just an extension of the green line.
Christine, that's a great point. If we went back with 6 slides, it would show all the things you put. What was the terminology you used, Ryan? And I apologize. The additional revenue spending considerations. So to Councilmember Hall's question and point, are there any items there that should be extraordinary as they're currently considered? I think we just led you with one, or you just led us with one. Are there any items there in addition that should be part of the ongoing general operating fund of those considerations there?
Anything beyond what's listed there? Is that what you're asking?
No. So I'm asking, sorry if I'm asking it in too vague a language. You have 6 revenue spending considerations. Should those be part of the general ongoing budget rather than considered as additional revenue spending considerations? In your worldview, if you were doing this budget and you didn't have a political body that you were looking for an answer for, would those be categorized like they are, or would they be categorized under the general fund?
Yes, in a perfect world, that would be part of our general fund operating budget. And really here, we've just pulled these particular items out to kind of show you, some of the hot button issues that may need to be considered during the budget process.
The 911 contribution, in the past, Roswell has been fortunate up until what year, 2020?
2022.
2022, that we have not had to subsidize it.
Right.
Can you tell us why what's changed about the dynamics there for us?
I think it's a combination of slow revenue growth and expenses that are increasing when it comes to, we've added positions over the years in that fund, and then increases regarding just the typical stuff, employee compensation, health benefits, things like that.
So maintenance capital is the big dollar expenditure here, correct?
Correct.
The other things, the employee merit-based compensation, we're just talking about giving people ongoing raises like you would do in any normal, hopefully, right? That's part of the piece. The other four pieces, well, we just talked general fund 911, partner organization funding, and the excess auto rental excise tax, and the hotel motel unrestricted transfer in. Those are, what would be, that expenditure, like you mentioned, the auto rentals going basically to Roswell Inc. historically. The 574 on the hotel motel unrestricted tax, that's going where?
It's just going to help fund the general fund.
Just
No
going-
particular purpose.
So there's nothing really sensitive about that.
Right.
What's sensitive about the partner organization funding?
It's fluctuated over the years, and especially the last couple of years with COVID, it's been very minimal. And so I'm just trying to, point that out to you all as something that is typically discussed during the budget process and can fluctuate from year to year. There's really no set policy or annual guidance that says this is definitely what we're doing this year. So just to provide that information to you all.
I'm just basically just counting there, see $950,000 that, I could see that have probably been part of political discourse. And I'm just trying to get a little education here on the problematic, because it's fairly small, I guess, in the big picture, but there's $1 million ostensibly that's been very loudly discussed. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you go on to the next? So basically, if the purple became green, because those are part of what we would want to consider our operating, our expenses are greater than our income,
Than our revenues for that year.
than our revenues. So that's just the point that I wanted everybody to be aware of. I mean, it's really all green because we have to spend that money.
Right.
Pretty much.
Spot on, well said.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to our enterprise funds, and these are a little bit quicker, and we'll be glad to answer any questions you have on those as well, of course. So we'll start with our water and sewer fund. So just to cover some of the assumptions here, the big one is in regards to our water utility customer fees and what adjustments that we're recommending or seeing within the forecast for the next 5 years. As you can see, for 23 and 24, there is currently already an approved rate increase for both of those years of 4%. In the forecast, we have projected continued increases in that fund of 4.5% from FY25 through FY27. Within that fund, we've also anticipated known and some projected increases in regards to Fulton County sewer rates. That affects us because we collect sewer fees for them, for our customers, and we keep a portion of that. And so we factor that into our forecast, along with certain assumptions for meter sales, capacity fees, and new growth and development. As with the other forecasts, we've included assumptions for operating expenses in regards to inflation, as well as assumptions for compensation, health, and retirement. The forecast also includes capital projects averaging about $500,000 annually. And then just for your information, this fund also has about $830,000 a year in debt service for the new water plant that opened several years ago. So graphically speaking, you can see this fund, based on those assumptions, is in the black for the forecasted period. So the black line here shows you the ending unrestricted fund balance, and we are positive by the end of FY27. This fund is a little different in terms of our budget principles and how we treat operating versus capital. We do use, as you can see, our revenues here don't cover all of our operating and all of our capital. So we use fund balance for capital and our enterprise fund, and that's a generally accepted practice of how we do things. And so as you can see, the purple represents the capital projects that are programmed and planned across the 5-year period. But over that time period, our revenues are covering all of our operating expenditures within those funds. Moving on to our solid waste fund, here in terms of our solid waste customer fees, again, there was, let me start here. So the forecast includes projected rate increases in the solid waste fund on the residential side of 5% in FY23 and FY24, and then 4% in the next 3 years. On the commercial side, we're projecting 4% annual increases for 23 through 27. Previously, Mayor and Council had already approved a 3% rate increase in FY23 and FY24. The reason that we're recommending an additional rate increase, as has already been discussed with you all a couple of weeks ago, is directly related to the impact of the waste management, yard waste, and recycling contract. That increase is expected to, or not expected, it will increase our expenses in this fund by $692,000 roughly in FY23, with projected annual increases thereafter capped at 4%. That, combined with just other inflationary increases regarding operating expenses like personnel, health benefits, all that kind of stuff, is what's driving the change in the fees that we're showing you here today. So again, based on these assumptions, our ending fund balance is in the black for this fund by the end of the forecast period. The other thing I'll point out here is this is our Fy22 estimate, and you can obviously see this is quite a bit larger this year. This includes the transfer station that's being constructed this year. So that includes the $3 million in revenue, loan proceeds that we'll be receiving, $3 million in costs that we'll be paying out for the construction of that facility. As we go into the outer years of the forecast, the capital, includes mostly replacing garbage trucks during that time period. And the operating expenses are the personnel and the contractual side of that supports those services. In our stormwater fund, again, beginning with our customer fees, the forecast includes projected rate increases of 4% annually for the course of the forecast. Again, here, Mayor and Council had previously approved a 2.5% increase in FY23 and FY24. The additional rate increase that we're recommending is primarily to address stormwater capital, the infrastructure repairs replacement that fund is responsible for, and to maintain an emergency reserve that is necessary for that fund. Significant amount of current year capital funds were actually diverted to emergency repairs that came about this year. I think it's 3 major projects that had to be addressed due to excessive rainfall. That eats into the fund balance of that fund, and so this rate increase allows for that department to perform about $1.1 million in annual stormwater capital projects.
Can I ask you a question, Ryan?
Sure.
And Randy, this is for you as well. are those, is this too conservative? Are we being too conservative on our potential needs from what we know?
That may be a question for,
I guess what I'm asking is, as we continue to gather information on this, right, we're continuing to see the need for this get larger and larger. So maybe, Sharon, you can address some of the thoughts going into this.
So this is a significant change from the 2.5 that we had previously programmed in for FY23 and 24, going to the 4%. I think in fairness, there is always a number of projects that we cannot get to in any given year. It depends on how quickly we want to chew through the projects that we're being presented with. I think we'd like to go with the 4% for FY23 and then see how we do. Unfortunately, this year in October, we had that series of projects that rose to an emergency status that we had to execute on very quickly. And then we were left with $136,000 for the rest of the year. So that was very concerning to us. So I think we need to see how these years play out, but I think that's a fair question, but I think we're comfortable going into this for FY23.
Sharon, thanks. I'm glad to hear that, because it does make me a little nervous, to be quite frank. So thank you.
so just to show you, oh yes. Mhm.
All right, the solid waste and the stormwater, is that all in one bill to the Roswell residents, or where those,
It's one bill. Mhm.
okay, and so the residents can see the fees they pay for both parts of that?
Right.
Thank you.
So just to wrap up the Stormwater Fund, again, here you see the capital and operating expenses, the blue and the purple lines. And you can see that we are, using fund balance every year to help fund some of the annual stormwater maintenance projects that are occurring, as well as I think the goal of the department is to maintain a level of around $750,000 in reserves to address emergency projects that come up that could, this year is a great example, I think, of emergency projects that total close to that amount. So in terms of next steps, no action is really being requested today. It's really just more information for you all. All of the different fee adjustments that we talked about in regards to our enterprise funds, those will be discussed throughout the budget process. And so you'll see that again many times throughout the budget process, and we won't be requesting final approval on that until the actual budget is adopted by you all. And then lastly, additional budget work sessions will be forthcoming, and we'll be able to gather any feedback or input that you might have for the budget process. To wrap up, I did just want to go over the budget calendar really quickly, and I know we're still working through some of these dates, so these aren't definite, but they're tentative. We're hoping to have another budget work session with you all this month, as well as another 2 in March, and we'll try and get those finalized and solidified as quickly as possible. Currently, nothing on the calendar in April in terms of budget work sessions. If there are topics that you all would like to see that haven't been addressed, we can certainly prepare for that. In May, May 9th is the tentative presentation of the proposed budget to the council at a council meeting. That's the last day, the last available opportunity that we're allowed to be able to present the budget to meet our requirements. Typically, in the past couple of years, once the budget has been proposed, we've had another work session following that where all the departments have come in to present to you all their proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year, and we'll get that date on the calendar as well. Assuming we continue to follow the schedule, the first reading of the budget ordinance would be scheduled for May 23rd. That would be the first reading, as well as any first consideration of changes to the proposed budget. And then June 13th is the tentative second reading of the budget ordinance. And that would be the second reading and the actual final adoption of that. And then, of course, our new fiscal year starts on July 1st.
Ryan?
Yes.
So, okay, so I see proposed June 13th. Can you go back? Was it May 23rd is first reading? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I saw a lot of blue and wasn't sure. I didn't read it. Thank you.
So that concludes the presentation, Mayor.
Ryan, outstanding job. I know on behalf of all of us, a lot of work goes into that. Great preparation to get us set up as we get into this budgetary process. And I know everybody appreciates your hard work and the hard work of your staff and the great diligence and preparation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Comments from council? Yes, sir. Councilman Worthing, forgive me.
Made a couple notes as we went along, so I'm going to kind of hit it all at the same time instead of jumping in and out. But this was put together by the Georgia College of Business School, Terry School of Business.
The economic outlook was.
Would it be beneficial for us to have a second report so we can compare forecasted numbers? Have we always had one report?
Typically, we've presented one report, but if that's something the council would like to see, I mean, you mean just kind of coming back to?
I'm checking their math is what I'm doing.
Sure. In terms of their assumptions about the state economy?
Right.
We could do something like that.
If it's a big fee, then, that's okay, but I was just curious, we have one report to in my mind, it'd be nice to have two reports to review on assuming inflation to one part as compared to a second part, where we're gonna go. I saw the FY 2023 as compared to the FY 2024 rates, 3.57, it's going down to 1.99. Can you hit on that real quick?
Sure. I think it's really just a function of, that data is provided by Moody's, by their anticipation that the rate of inflation is going to moderate as we move forward in 2022. From what I'm seeing and reading, as shift in terms of people's purchases, consumers' purchases, is shifting. It shifted totally to goods almost during the pandemic. It's starting to move back towards services, and I think from what I'm reading, what they're expecting is that as that transition occurs, it's going to slow down the goods side of things, give companies the time to catch up on production, and help to bring down the inflation that's being driven by the demand that's excessive.
With interest rates going up, that's going to help curb the demand as well. But one thing I didn't hear is real estate and how that would play. You're talking about goods and services as compared to these, COVID gave us a one-time inflow of cash. But I'm just curious if there's any kind of forecasting on real estate for Roswell itself.
Sure, I don't have any hard numbers, but just generally, what I'm seeing is that and this is multiple different sources, and I can provide those to you, but what I'm seeing is that real estate is still expected to be a big driver in the state economy, just because there's still more demand than there is available supply. And from also what I was reading that with the changes in the workplace driven by the pandemic, that the real estate market and finding the right house, finding the right size house is more important to people, and they're willing to spend more to get that. And so because of that, what I'm seeing is that the real estate market's going to continue to be a strong driver in the economy, at least in 2022.
All right. You use the term one-time scenarios, and I've lost my definition there, but how would you, could you put a year on one time for it to fall in that category? Are we talking about 15 years, 25 years? A sidewalk is basically forever. It's just you've got to maintain the sidewalk.
Sure.
Sidewalk is a one-time scenario. What is one time year-wise?
It's in a single year. So, I mean, if obviously, yes, we have to build a sidewalk, we're going to have to maintain it into the future. It's going to have a certain life expectancy. In our minds, though, we would consider anything that wasn't there previously that we're building completely new as kind of a one-time expense, with the idea that, of course, down the road, there's going to be replacement costs and maintenance costs associated with it.
I got you. Two more.
Sure.
All right. E911, I think Mayor Wilson hit on this earlier, was supplemented. Do you anticipate us having to do that again?
Yes.
Okay.
And that was some of the numbers we showed. We're expecting that to increase over the next 5 years, and it to get a little worse as we go. So this line here shows from 290, we transferred 290,000 this current year. We're expecting that to grow through the next 5 years of the forecast. I don't have all the details, but I know I've read about and I've heard Chief Conroy speak to this as well, that there's been discussions in the past couple years about increasing 911 fees because this is a problem across the board in terms of local governments. It was supposed to happen a few years ago. It didn't happen, but I know that it's something that's kind of always on the drawing board for consideration. So that would be helpful to us.
Sure. And the last one, we were talking about deficit balance on 2025 to 2027 on the 5-year forecast. Can you give us your best opinion around how to turn that around?
Well, I think that something important to keep in mind is that this is more of an exercise based on a set of assumptions, and obviously things are going to change as we go forward. So, we're going to have, what we're showing you today is that in FY23 and FY24, we're going to budget this much and we're going to spend every penny of it. That never happens because we always have turnover. We're going to have vacancy savings. We're going to have savings on the operating side as well. That's going to make those numbers fluctuate. I would say that, we also try to be conservative when it comes to revenues because we don't want to overpromise on property taxes and sales tax. And so there's, a likely chance that we'll see, we're being realistic, but, there's obviously the chance that, revenues could perform better than we anticipate. So all those things are going to kind of feed into adjusting those numbers, and it's an exercise today. When we get to FY25, obviously we'll make whatever changes and adjustments we need to have a balanced budget. But this is really meant to just kind of point out some trends and things to keep in mind as we move forward.
To get our attention.
Yep.
There you go.
Thanks, Councilman Morthland. Councilmember Hills.
Councilmember Morthland took all of my questions that were really good, so I'll just end with this one. You were talking about in the revenue assumptions, the school district receives money from the West Alley build. Can you elaborate on that, just how that works, please?
Sure. I don't have the details in front of me, but it's in the past when it comes to development and granting special incentives and things like that to spur development. It's been controversial when schools miss out on revenue or revenue is taken away from the schools going forward. And so I think in an effort to prevent that from happening, something that's been occurring for I'm not sure how long, is that in these types of economic development agreements, there could be provisions for the school, at least the school district, to continue to receive what they were receiving today, so that the schools aren't losing out on revenue. There's not as much consideration, I guess, for the city, on the city side of things.
So I think you said school district, that's not just the schools that are in Roswell. So do we benefit from other builds in other areas, like our Roswell schools that are they're Fulton County, and does this parlay into any of our private schools?
It's just the school district, so it's whoever was receiving the property tax revenue before, then they'll continue to receive that base level that they've always received. I think they include some growth assumptions in there, so it increases a little bit as they go. But it's whatever school district that property falls within, then that school district continues to receive some property tax payment from that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Hills. Any other council members, questions, thoughts, comments? City Administrator, Mr. Knight, any comments or thoughts?
No, thank you, Ryan, for a very detailed report. Just a couple of items. One is that, we've been having some conversation with some of our surrounding cities about recycling agreements, which we'll have further discussion with the council upcoming. And then the second part is the loss negotiations. Of course, the county has to make the call by the middle of June, and then there's a 60-day, essentially a 60-day negotiating period. If within that 60-day period, the end of it, there's not an agreement, then there's some type of mediation arbitration that has to go into account. And then it has to be done by the end of the year, December 31st of this year, or the tax goes away for all parties. Obviously, that's a doomsday scenario, but it's something that I just wanted to highlight because it's a very important and significant funding source, of course, for all jurisdictions. And it's something that happens essentially every 10 years or so. And we are in that window, or getting close to that window now, to come to a lost agreement.
No, Mr. Knighton, thanks for reminding us that exactly this year we are entering into loss negotiations, which occur every 10 years. And it is a big, big deal to this city and all of our sister cities as well. So we will obviously keep it abreast as that continues to move forward. I also want to remind everyone that these workshops are public meetings. They're held currently in room 220 here in City Hall. We hold those at 5 p.m. generally speaking, and they are publicly notified. So I want to make sure that a lot of detail and a lot of business will be conducted as we go through the course of the year in these workshops and in committee meetings. And I want to make sure the public understands and knows they are welcome to attend and be with us in these meetings. With that being said, Ryan, thank you for your great work. I know everybody appreciates it. And if anyone has anything further, this meeting's adjourned.